Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Craftworld Eldar Shroud Runners and how to use them in 10th edition. So Shroud Runners were one of my favorite units in 9th edition. I thought they were really awesome, and I actually, believe it or not, started out hating Shroud Runners when they were first introduced. Because to me, at that time, they seemed like a mixed role unit that didn't really know what it wanted to do. However, over the course of 9th edition, it really grew on me. The unit was so awesome, in fact, that I ran a list with 3 full units of them. Yeah, a little bit crazy, I know. Probably not the most efficient thing, but it was a hell of a time and it was super fun to use. Well, I'm happy to say that Shroud Runners are still very good in 10th edition and they're alive and well in many ways. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the video and talk about Shroud Runners in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. We're going to be reviewing the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Shroud Runners, their strengths and weaknesses, their combos and synergies, and lastly, the role Shroud Runners play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. So as far as their stats go, they have pretty basic jet bike stats. They're very fast at movement 14. They have a 4+ save, which is a little bit worse than jet bikes, but not by much. And the reason for that is because jet bikes like this can now benefit from cover. So they can always basically get a 3+ save if they're in cover. And they also have a 5+ invulnerable save versus shooting. So versus range attacks. In addition, they also have an extra wound over the normal jet bikes, which increases their durability slightly. As far as their ranged weapons, they're armed with Ranger long rifles. So just your basic sniper rifle. They don't have the heavy keyword, unfortunately, so you can't stand still and get +1 to hit. But they do hit on a 3+. That's a little worse than last edition. They do also have a scatter laser, which, again, a little worse than last edition because they don't hit as often, and scatter lasers are 1 less strength than they were. So by themselves, they do a little bit less damage than they did last edition, but there's a lot more combos and synergies that are available to them that can give them extra damage as well. And lastly, they also have pistols. These do, funnily enough, hit on a 2+. So these did keep their high ballistic skill. They have the assault keyword. You'd really only use these if you were advancing. As for their melee weapons, they're just armed with the basic close combat weapon. They only have 1 attack apiece. You would think they would have 2 attacks because there's 2 rangers on there, but alas, they only have 1 attack. Not too big of a deal considering they don't want to be in combat in the first place. As for their special rules, they have 2 core rules, Scout 9, so that means they can make a 9-inch scout move. Again, not as powerful as last edition when they could make a full move, but still pretty good. And they have the Stealth special rule, so they get -1 to hit permanently against range attacks, which is really useful, especially against attacks that maybe ignore line of sight, that also ignore the indirect fire hit penalty. There's a lot of weapons out there that do that. They're indirect, but they ignore the hit penalty for some reason. In this case, those units will still be suffering a -1 to hit. They also have the ability Target Acquisition. So they had this ability last edition, but basically what it did is it just removed cover from attacks made by your Ranger long rifles in your army. So that wasn't that great. A lot of the times you weren't even worrying about the damage that the Ranger long rifles did. Your Rangers were performing secondary actions and things like that, so they weren't often shooting. So it was basically a dead ability, except on the Shroud Runners themselves. However, it's much better now. And basically what it does is you can mark a unit within 12 inches at the start of your shooting phase, and the rest of your army gets lethal hits against that unit. Now, it does have to be visible to the Shroud Runners themselves, so you can't just mark a target that's out of line of sight. But you can mark targets that these guys can see, and because they're very fast, they often will get line of sight to those targets. And lethal hits may not seem that great at first because a lot of our anti-infantry units already have lethal hits. Swooping Hawks, Dire Avengers, Wraith Guard with a Spirit Seer, they already have those abilities, so it may seem redundant. But there are units in our index that benefit greatly from this ability. Namely, Dark Reapers and Shadow Specters. Also, just regular Windrider jet bikes, either with the shuriken cannons or scatter lasers, are amazing with this as well. And this is a really potent damage buff for those units. So if you do have a lot of those types of units in your army, in my opinion, the Shroud Runners are an auto-include just because they ramp up the damage of those units by so much. Especially if you're going after a Death Star type of unit, these guys can ramp up the damage considerably. They can be taken in squads of 3 or 6. Squad of 3 costs 80 points, and that's going to be more of your support and utility unit, meant for marking targets and things like that. Your unit of 6 is going to cost 160, and they're going to be your long-range damage dealing unit, because at that point you're having, 6 scatter lasers, 6 ranger long rifles in the unit, plus other buffs, which you will probably inevitably cast on them because, with big units we have stuff like Guide and, Doom and stuff like that. And that actually makes them very reasonable for what they do. So they are less points in last edition. That's also something to mention. Even after they got reduced in points, they still cost 90 points for a unit. And now they only cost 80 points for a unit. So yeah, there's a couple of things that got nerfed on them, but they also got reduced in points as a result. And arguably, they have much better synergies with certain things. And by the way, the Bladestorm stratagem, great stratagem for this unit. It's amazing. Because they have scatter lasers and ranger long rifles, they have a lot of firepower, and in a unit of 6, they can make great use out of that -2 AP. As far as their keywords go, they do have the mounted and fly keywords, so it does make it harder for them to move completely through ruins, but they're jet bikes, and that's going to be an issue with every jet bike unit. So the good news is these guys aren't like Shining Spears. They're not a combat unit, so a lot of times you're just going to shoot your target, and moving through a ruin isn't going to be that big of a deal. Okay, so what are their strengths and weaknesses? So their strengths are they're extremely fast. They have Scouts 9, Movement 14, and basically with that, they can threaten any target on the board or score objectives. If you need to mark a target really bad, they can also advance. You can always use a Fate dice to advance them 6, and they're getting much bigger of a threat range at that point as well. So with basically Movement 20, they can mark a target within 32 inches of them at the start of that turn, which is a really powerful ability if you need a unit dead across the board, and you have other units in a position to deal with it with their lethal hits. They have solid damage for the cost and can debuff enemy units with the mark target ability, and that's basically, in my opinion, the best thing about them is that mark target ability is just amazing for building up a list. It's a really awesome damage multiplier, and it helps a lot of units in our index. Their weaknesses are they do have to get within 12 inches to mark targets, and they're fairly squishy. If anybody has some serious Overwatch ability, these guys will die. Now, the good news is if you're only using them to mark a target, even if you lose 2 Shroud Runners and you still have 1 left, you can still mark that target. There's nothing that says you can't use their mark target ability while battle shocked or anything like that. So even if they manage to get the last Shroud Runner to like 1 wound, as long as you have that 1 wound left, you can mark a target, and your whole army is going to get lethal hits against that unit. So, yeah, that is a weakness. They do have to get close, which means they do have to probably brave Overwatch, but it's not the worst thing in the world if you're just using them to mark targets, because they're not that expensive either. As far as their combos and synergies go, they multiply the damage of high-volume shooting units considerably. Things like Dark Reapers, Shadow Specters, or Wind Riders come to mind. Dark Reapers with the Tempest Launcher is an obvious choice, but also their Star Swarm missiles and Star Shot missiles are fairly good with this, especially since Dark Reapers are cheap and you can take multiple units of them for a fairly low cost. Guide is an extremely powerful tool, especially on bigger units, because you're going to be throwing out so many attacks. Doom can also help them hit harder against infantry and even allow them to dent harder targets. So that's really powerful as well if you do include Eldrad in your list. Other Shroud Runners synergize well with Shroud Runners because they benefit from their own mark target ability. And because they have a high volume of fire, they happen to be a good reciprocant of that ability as well. Vipers also remove cover, making enemy units easier to kill. So all of those things help Shroud Runners deal more damage, and of course multiply the damage of other units in your army. And if you guys recall that video I made on Shadow Specters where I talked about the synergy with Shroud Runners, just think about a unit of 11 of these guys shooting at a marked target with their blast weapons, with their disperse shots, and that's 75 plus shots going into a unit of 20, even if that unit is exceptionally tough, even if there's something like Necron Warriors or something along those lines. All of them are going to die. With lethal hits, combined with just the AP -1 and other buffs you could possibly throw on them, they're just going to absolutely murder that unit of Necrons or whatever it is. So this is a very powerful tool that you have in your disposal. And it makes Shroud Runners one of the best buffing units in the entire index. So what is the role of Shroud Runners in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? Well, Shroud Runners are a versatile unit that can score on objectives or multiply your other unit's damage considerably. So their incredible speed does allow them to threaten flanks and sneak into your opponent's deployment zone to score on secondaries. They are very fast. As a unit of 3, obviously you're not going to want to do this as a big max unit, but as a unit of 3, they're very small. They have a decently small profile. They can hide fairly easily behind obscuring terrain. And this can help them get into better positions so that they can score on secondaries without having your opponent, kill them. Their marked target ability is also very good, and it turns anti-infantry units into absolute blenders. Dark Reapers, Shadow Specters, Wind Riders, any of those units are fantastic, and because this is a debuff, it affects an enemy unit, your whole army can get the benefit. So this is great at just blending through Death Stars. I know it doesn't seem like that, but a common tactic and trick for a lot of opponents to do now is to park a big, almost unkillable unit in the center of the board. Most often, that's going to be an infantry unit with a high toughness and a high armor save. Things like Wraith Guard, right? Wraith Blades, if you're playing another Eldar player, or, this could be things like Terminators, right? Terminators have that 4+ invul save, so really high AP attacks aren't typically the best weapons to use against them in most cases. I mean, they are still good, but they're not exactly the best. So a better maneuver here would just be to saturate them with low strength, low AP attacks, anti-horde attacks basically with buffs. So you have your Shroud Runners, they're marking the target, and then you just light them up with a bunch of lethal hit units like Dark Reapers or Shadow Specters and things like that. And you will force a lot of them to die because they're going to fail saves, right? Especially if you remove their cover. Dark Reapers and Shadow Specters have an AP of 1 on their attacks in most cases, so they will be able to punch through a considerable amount of those heavy troops. Okay, so the last thing you have to ask yourself though, right, is with Shroud Runners, should I run them as a minimum or maximum unit, right? Should I run them as a unit of 3 or 6? Because both of them are very viable. So a minimum unit is going to be more of a scoring and support unit. You're not going to deal a whole bunch of damage with them, but they're more of a supporting tool for the rest of your army. This is a unit that's great for secondaries and enhancing the damage of your anti-infantry elements. In most cases, you're not going to want to sacrifice a big unit of 6 Shroud Runners so they can just mark a target, right? That's way too expensive for their ability. But a unit of 3 can do this relatively easily and is relatively expendable, so you can get rid of those big elements in your opponent's army. It's also great for secondaries because they're fast. As a squad of 3, they're very maneuverable and easy to hide. And you're not really sacrificing a lot by having them score on objectives. Even if they're out of line of sight, maybe they don't have line of sight on anything, but they're scoring you secondaries, so they're making up their points in that way. If you do want to field a max unit, it is going to be more of an artillery unit, a long-range unit that functions as a damage dealer. And this kind of unit will benefit greatly from buffs like Guide and the Viper's ability to remove cover. And yeah, these guys don't have battle focus anymore, but for one command point, you can phantasm them back behind a ruin and they can be very safe. A 7-inch move is always going to be able to get a full unit of Shroud Runners back to safety. And with buffs like Guide, possibly Doom, and maybe even another minimum unit of Shroud Runners to mark a target, these guys can pump out some serious damage at long range, right? They're hitting on 3s, re-rolling hits, and you have lethal hits because if you mark a target, you can just go for those lethals. So you could even just re-roll all the dice if you wanted to with Guide and just fish for those lethal hits, which means that this unit can actually punch far above its weight class, which is exceptional. I plan on running these guys as both units of 3 and a bigger unit of 6 at some point. I've already run them as units of 3 and they make great secondary objective scorers. They're good at scoring on behind enemy lines and deploy teleport homers as well as engage in all fronts because they are very fast, right? Movement 14, plus they have Scout, plus they have the ability to advance if they want to, right? So these guys are very quick as well. I've been running them as a unit of 3, but they're equally good as a unit of 6. They're just used in a slightly different way. And not for nothing, but they're a pretty good unit to Overwatch because they have a long range on their weapons. Because when Overwatch shoots, they will be guided. A big unit of these guys will do considerable damage to enemy units walking within 24 inches. Or deep striking for that matter. So in conclusion, Shroud Runners are a super useful unit to include in your army and perform a variety of roles depending on how you want to field them and what the situation calls for. Although they are not as potentially tough as they were last edition, they're not going to be holding primary objectives anymore. Their ability to mark targets is absolutely brutal in combination with a high volume of fire. You are going to be getting an insane amount of lethal hits with this unit as well as other units shooting at that marked target. And lastly, and probably the most important thing, they are a super fun unit that you will get value out of every game if used well. And they look really cool to boot. So they're a really cool looking unit. It's not like warp spiders where you kind of, you look at them and it's like, yeah, I'm using them because they're good, but god damn, they have old sculpts. They don't look super cool anymore. I still personally like warp spiders, but I know a lot of you just don't like the old sculpts. And honestly, I feel you. A lot of the older sculpts don't look as good and they have not aged well whatsoever in comparison with a lot of other units. But this unit is an exception. It's a new kit. It looks really cool. The Rangers look awesome. They're very dynamic. And they just have a really awesome cool factor that you do need to consider when running these guys. Because, like everything else in the Index and Warhammer 40k, it's about having fun, right? You do want to win, of course. You want to make the best list that you can. But you also want stuff that you have fun with. And Shroud Runners are a super fun unit. And personally, one of my favorites. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. I do want to mention I am going to make a video covering the latest index changes, erratas, and FAQs that came out yesterday or this morning at some point. I am going to cover that tomorrow. The Eldar did get affected by it, but hopefully I can talk everybody through that and just kind of go over what changed and what we need to worry about and what's not really that big of a deal. And in a lot of ways, I think the errata was fair. So we will talk about that tomorrow. I will make a video on that covering it and all the changes that you need to know of and how it affects your army. But yeah, that's for tomorrow. And then we will continue our Corsair and Outcast series after that. All right, everybody, thank you so much once again to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. I really appreciate your help in making the channel better. Thank you so much once again for your support. If you do want to become a Patreon member, you can do so. It is free. I have free trials activated. So you can go ahead and just click on the link in the description if you want to become a Patreon member and join our growing Discord channel. So our Discord is a community of Eldar players that discuss tactics, strategies, and hobbying. And we just have a lot of fun in there, shoot the shit a little bit and stuff like that. So it's a fun place to be, to learn, and also just to, talk about your favorite faction, which of course is the Craftworld Eldar. If you do also want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel, check out my store page. I have a huge store filled with Eldar-inspired merchandise. If you want to rep your favorite faction in your local game store, give it a look and see what catches your eye. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. Have some great games this week, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.